Today, we're going to read A Call to Arms, which is in Chapter 5, Lesson 3 on page 120. As we're reading through, I'm going to take notes down on the board, and you will make sure and copy them into your paper. The easiest thing to do is follow the outline format, which I will use, and then you can use this outline tomorrow when you take a short quiz on what you listened to and the notes that you took. So if you turn to page 120 in your book, you can see Lesson 3, A Call to Arms. Again, picking up from where the film left off in A Boston Tea Party, we're now going to learn why the colonists decided to finally go fight. A Call to Arms. A meeting in Philadelphia. On your notes, create a little outline and put meeting in Philadelphia. And then we add a little A for our first note. In September 1774, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia. They had come to set up a political body that would represent Americans and challenge British control. The delegates called this body the Continental Congress. So Continental Congress is extremely important to note because it was the first time that Americans were coming together to truly try and overcome what was going on with the British at the time. Leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies attended the meeting. Only Georgia did not send a representative. Massachusetts sent fiery Samuel Adams and his lawyer cousin John Adams. New York sent John Jay, another lawyer. Virginia sent George Washington as well as Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry, two outspoken defenders of colonial rights. Patrick Henry wanted the colonies to unite in firm resistance to Britain. He summed up the meaning of the meeting when he addressed the delegates on its second day. The distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englands are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. So, as a B note, we're going to write down delegates, and we're going to note some of the famous delegates that came. Just to remember, the only delegate, or the only state that wasn't represented by a delegate was Georgia. But we're going to note 3 of these famous delegates. So note down 3. And the first one is, of course, George Washington, who will later become the first president. But it was important to note that he was at this Continental Congress. The second person that we're going to note is Patrick Henry. And he gives some famous speeches. And one of the most famous speeches is, "Give me liberty or give me death." Basically that we should die instead of being held under British rule. And the third person is Samuel Adams. And Samuel Adams and his cousin John Adams are extremely famous for the help that they did during the Revolutionary War. So on number 2, we're now going to go on to the delegates' vote. So make sure you note the delegates' vote as your second part of your outline. The delegates discussed complaints against the British. Then they voted. In a statement of grievances, the delegates called for the repeal of 13 acts of Parliament. They believed these laws violated the laws of nature, the principles of the English Constitution, and the several charters of the colonies. The delegates also voted to boycott British trade. The colonies would not import or use any British goods, nor would they sell their goods to Great Britain. Continental Congress delegates also decided to endorse the Suffolk Resolves, prepared by the people of Boston and other Suffolk counties in Massachusetts. These resolutions declared the coercive acts to be illegal. They called on the county's residents to arm themselves against the British. After delegates endorsed the resolves, other colonies also organized militias, or groups of citizens. So, some of the major things to note is that they wanted to repeal 13 acts of Parliament. And remember, some of these acts that were affecting the colonists and were upsetting the colonists were the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, etc., that we talked about last week. And in addition to this, they also wanted to ensure that the coercive acts were deemed illegal. So coercive acts illegal. Although we didn't talk about the coercive acts very much, we want to note on here that the coercive acts were also called the intolerable acts. So if you hear coercive or intolerable, they both mean the same thing, and basically the intolerable acts were punishment for the Boston Tea Party. Punishment for the Boston Tea Party, which was what occurred in the Liberty Kid video that we watched on Friday and then on Monday. So to set our next part of the outline, you're going to put a 3 onto your paper in Roman numerals and write down the colonial militias. And remember, the militias are just groups of basically regular citizens, particularly regular male citizens at the time, that would fight against the British. So the colonial militias. American colonists had a long tradition of serving and protecting their communities in militias. Members of a militia were an important part of each town's defense. Militia members trained and had drills with the other citizen soldiers. They practiced using muskets and cannons. Each member was required to provide his own weapon, usually a musket and ammunition. Later, as tension between Britain and the colonies grew, towns began to gather and store more military supplies. So we're going to note some facts about militias. So facts about militias. These are some important things to note. So at the beginning, provided own musket. As war came around, they started to receive help from the towns. And then finally, that the militias were basically made up of people called Minutemen. And Minutemen were supposed to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. So now we are finally getting right to where the war begins. So now we are getting to where the war begins. After all of these acts and the colonists are finally upset, they come together at the Continental Congress and have become fed up with the British rule, so they are now going to start their fighting. So if you turn to page 122, it starts off with fighting begins. Fighting begins. Many colonists believed that if fighting with the British were to break out, it would happen in New England. Militias in Massachusetts held drills, made bullets, and stockpiled weapons. Some militias were known as Minutemen because they boasted they would be ready to fight at a minute's notice. In the winter of 1774 to 1775, a British officer stationed in Boston noted in his diary, "The people are evidently making every preparation for resistance. They are taking every means to provide themselves with arms." So, we're now going to do our number 4, and number 4 is Great Britain sends troops. Great Britain sends troops. The British also got ready for a fight. King George told Parliament that the New England colonies were in a state of rebellion and that blows must decide who would control America. By April 1775, several thousand British troops were in and around Boston, with more on the way. British General Thomas Gage had orders to seize the weapons from the Massachusetts militia and arrest the leaders. Gage learned that the militia stored arms and ammunition at Concord, a town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. He ordered 700 troops under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all the artillery and ammunition you can find. So now we're going to write A here, and under Great Britain sends troops, we're going to note that April 1775 becomes one of the major years and major months. And specifically, Gage decides that he is going to send 700 troops, so 700 soldiers, to Lexington. And why? To destroy stockpiled weapons. So what's about to happen is Gage, when he sends these troops to Lexington, we're going to see the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So in the next section, section 5, we see the British on the move. On the night of April 18, 1775, colonial protest leader Dr. Joseph Warren walked through Boston. Watching for any unusual activity by the British, he saw troops marching out of the city. Warren alerted Paul Revere and William Dawes, members of the Sons of Liberty. Revere and Dawes rode to Lexington, a town east of Concord, to spread the word that the British were coming. Revere galloped across the countryside, shouting his warning of the approaching troops. Hearing the news, Samuel Adams said, "What a glorious morning this is." He was ready to fight. A British patrol later captured Dawes and Revere. Another rider named Samuel Prescott carried the warning to Concord. So the most important thing to note under the British on the move is Paul Revere. And we consider Paul Revere's famous ride. And what happens is Paul Revere is basically the warner that the British are coming. So now we're going to get into the first battles of the Revolutionary War. So our section 6 will be entitled Lexington and Concord. And Lexington and Concord are where the Revolutionary War actually starts after the protest and the rebellions against the British imposition of taxes. Meanwhile, the British continued their march. At dawn, the Redcoats approached Lexington. There, they ran into about 70 waiting Minutemen. Led by Captain John Parker, the Minutemen stood on the town common with muskets in hand. Badly outnumbered, the Minutemen were about to give way to the Redcoats. Just then, a shot was fired, from where is still not clear. Both sides let loose an exchange of bullets. When the shooting ended, 8 Minutemen lay dead. The British continued on to Concord. While some troops burned the few weapons they found, the others met a group of Minutemen waiting at the North Bridge. In a short battle, the British took heavy losses. They began to make their way back to Boston. All along the road, colonists hid behind trees and fired on the soldiers. By the time the Redcoats reached Boston, at least 174 were wounded and 73 were dead. About 60 years later, poet Waldo Emerson wrote in the Concord Hymn that the Americans at Lexington and Concord had fired the shot heard round the world. The battle for independence had begun. So as the British are traveling to Concord, so Brits to Concord, we have a few things happen. Near Lexington, they are basically attacked by 70 Minutemen. But the important thing to note is no one is sure of who shot the first bullet. No one is sure of first shot. Then, as they continue on their way to Concord, they kept burning weapons and then they finally made it there, but they took heavy losses. Now they start to return to Boston. And we have an important thing to note is that 174 were wounded on the British side. We'll just put B for British. And 73 dead. One of the other things to note about the British is they are often called redcoats because their old military uniform, which you can see in the book on the next page on 124, was a bright red uniform coat. So they were called the redcoats as a shorthand term for them. Additionally, one of the things to note over on the side of your page is the term the shot heard round the world. And this has become a famous line for the beginning of the Revolutionary War in Lexington and Concord. Now we've officially begun the Revolutionary War. Lexington and Concord are considered the starts, and now we're continuing on with more military action. So if you turn to page 124, we'll read through the opening section there, more military action, and then take some notes on the Battle of Bunker Hill and choosing sides. More military action. After the battles at Lexington and Concord, armed conflict with British forces quickly spread. Benedict Arnold, a captain in the Connecticut militia, raised a force of 400 to seize Fort Ticonderoga near Lake Champlain in New York. Ticonderoga occupied a key location. It was also rich in military supplies. Arnold learned that Ethan Allen of nearby Vermont also planned the attack on the fort. So Arnold joined forces with Allen's men, the so-called Green Mountain Boys. Together they took the British by surprise. Fort Ticonderoga surrendered on May 10, 1775. Later, Arnold became a traitor to the Patriot cause. He sold military information to the British. When his crime was discovered in September 1780, he fled to British-controlled New York City. There he commanded British troops and led raids against the Americans in Virginia and Connecticut. So the only thing to know in your paper is Benedict Arnold, and he is the most famous traitor in America. So if you ever hear the term Benedict Arnold or somebody is called a Benedict Arnold, it just means they're a traitor. So we'll continue with our notes now, and section 7 will be the Battle of Bunker Hill. Following Lexington and Concord, more volunteers joined the colonial militias. Soon, militia around Boston numbered about 20,000 strong. The British remained in control of the city, with the militia camped nearby. On June 16, 1775, militia commanded by Colonel William Prescott set up posts on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, across the harbor from Boston. The next day, the Redcoats assembled at Breed's Hill. Bayonets drawn, they charged. Low on ammunition, Prescott reportedly ordered, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The Americans opened fire, forcing the British to retreat. Twice more, the Redcoats charged, receiving furious fire from above. Finally, the Americans ran out of gunpowder and had to withdraw. The battle on Breed's Hill, which became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, was a British victory. Yet the British suffered heavy losses of more than 1,000 dead and wounded. They were learning that defeating the Americans on the battlefield would be neither quick nor easy. So, the big thing to note about the Battle of Bunker Hill is that the British suffered heavy losses. So, British heavy losses. And with those heavy losses, we now are going to have the British are a bit more wary of the fight. It's no longer something simple. They don't expect that they're just going to win immediately. It's actually going to take some time to win. So we continue on with our last section in the book, and that section is section 8, which is called Choosing Sides. As news spread about these battles, the colonists each faced a major decision: to join the rebels or remain loyal to Great Britain. Those who sided with Britain, the Loyalists, did not think unfair taxes and laws justified a rebellion. Some were office holders who felt a responsibility to uphold British rule. Others had not suffered from British policies and saw no reason to break with Britain. Still others believed Britain would win the war and did not want to be on the losing side. The Patriots, on the other hand, supported the war. They believed that the colonists should have the right to govern themselves. The Patriots were determined to fight the British until American independence was won. The American Revolution was not just a war between America and Britain, it was also a civil war, Patriots against Loyalists. So we have our two sides here, put A and B. The first side were Loyalists, which is just a term for colonist for England. They had their varied reasons, but if they were termed a loyalist, they supported the English in this time period of the American Revolution. The other side were the Patriots. And the Patriots were considered those who thought America should be independent, and that we can govern ourselves. So now we have finally the war starting and these different sides emerging. So you have two sides that are actually occurring right in the United States. So these are actually occurring in the US. And then you also had the separate occurrence between the Patriots and the actual British troops who were coming over from England and didn't consider themselves part of the colonies.